The mainstream media here in America is facing heavy criticism for its coverage of Monday's news out of Gaza. Anya Parampil is in DuPont Circle here in D.C. tonight. Anya, you've been monitoring the media's reaction to yesterday's events in Gaza. What can you tell us tonight?
Hi there, Ed. Well, as you mentioned, the demonstrations here are only now just getting underway, so I'll be speaking with participants and bringing you their comments later this evening. But for now, I want to tackle the question you just raised. How did the mainstream media cover yesterday's massacre in Gaza? And simply put, Ed, it's been an almost across-the-board obfuscation of Israel's responsibility for the violence. Let's start with the New York Times, which violated basic journalism 101 here by filing a headline in the passive voice saying at least 28 Palestinians die in protests as U.S. prepares to open Jerusalem embassy. After they came under heavy criticism online, they changed that to Israeli troops kill dozens of Palestinian protesters as U.S. embassy opens. But across the board, not just the New York Times, take a look at this compilation of other mainstream sources, the Washington Post, the Guardian, the BBC, all mysteriously referencing Gaza deaths, Gaza violence, Gaza clashes. You wouldn't know these deaths came by the hand of the Israeli army firing on demonstrators, and you would just think, oh, these protesters died right near the border fence. And let's talk about that word clashes, Ed. That would lead you to believe there are casualties or injuries on the Israeli side, which none at the level of the Palestinians have been reported. Instead, we have dozens of Palestinians killed. And we're not talking about a scenario here in which police fired on a crowd and hit a few people. These are highly trained snipers positioned at a border fence with a wide view of the demonstrations. They have to look through the scope at the 14-year-old boy, at the man with no legs, at the individuals clearly marked as press and medical workers, and decide to pull the trigger. And that is, of course, what we've seen Israel do not just yesterday, but throughout the protests of the Great Return March over the last several weeks. And one final point I want to make, Ed, is the emphasis the media has put on Trump's decision to move the embassy to Jerusalem. While that is factoring into the protests, the main reason these demonstrations are happening now is because the move coincided with Israel's Independence Day, what's known as the Palestinians as the Nakba, or Day of Catastrophe, because the creation of Israel marked the date when over 700,000 Palestinians were forced out of their homes in order to make way for the Jewish state. And now that's led to the displacement of millions of refugees around the world, which brings us to the situation in Gaza, Ed. What we have to understand about Gaza specifically is that it's a densely populated area, almost 2 million people forced to live in what is an open-air prison controlled by Israel. Israel controls what goes in and what goes out, and 80% of the population there are these refugees. Their homes, their land are in Israel. They're not allowed to return. They're not even allowed to leave to get medical treatment. You may remember from my reporting in the Gaza Strip just a few months ago, Ed, I talked about the dire situation people are facing there. 4 hours of energy, unable to travel to get medical support, raw sewage being pumped into their beaches because they have no way to treat their water. That is the reason people are willing to risk their lives in the thousands at the border with Israel, knowing the Israelis will fire with impunity, and you would not know any of that if you were watching the mainstream media.
All right, thank you, Anya.